Yes, good morning. Welcome to this webinar, which is being organized on behalf of
Welcome
the
to
World
everyone.
Breastfeeding Protection Day. The topic is how the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes is being implemented in the Americas. And first of all, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Vanessa Garcia Larsen. She is the Chief of the Risk Factors and Nutrition Unit of the Department of Non-Communicable Diseases and Mental Health of the Pan American Health Organization to deliver the opening remarks. Vanessa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Leo. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization in collaboration with the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, to present how the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes is being implemented in the Americas. The World Breastfeeding Protection Day, celebrated annually on May 21st, underscores the critical importance of the implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and subsequent relevant resolutions of the World Health Assembly, collectively recognized as the Code. The International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes was adopted by the World Health Assembly in 1981 under Resolution 34.22. The aim of this resolution was to protect families from the infant formula industry's aggressive marketing tactics to promote breast milk substitutes, which was at the time and continues to be contributing to declining breastfeeding rates and increasing child morbidity and mortality. Digital technologies are increasingly used for marketing food products throughout the world, and the code does not directly address many of the specific strategies used in digital marketing. Following a mandate by the World Health Assembly, the World Health Organization coordinated research and released a report describing how digital marketing strategies are being used for the promotion of breast milk substitutes. It was found that women are exposed to digital marketing in all countries, and in some of these countries, over 80% of women have seen advertisements online. Also, women are exposed to highly targeted content made visible only to them. Collectively, it was found that the 264 breast milk substitute brand accounts monitored for the research posted content around 90 times per day and reached over 220 million users. The report also showed that digital marketing increases breast milk substitute purchases and that it is better value for money than traditional marketing. Resolution 3422 from the World Health Assembly clearly stated that governments should take action to give effect to the principles and aims of this code as appropriate to their social and legislative framework, including the adoption of national legislation, regulations, or other suitable measures. However, progress in this respect has been lagging in the countries of our region. According to 2022 report on status of the code published by the WHO, to date, only 19 of 35 countries in the region have adopted any legal measures for the code. And of these, only 2 countries are substantially aligned with the code. While there is inaction on the part of many countries, marketing of breast milk substitutes has become even more pervasive and aggressive and has necessitated new guidance from WHO on regulatory measures aimed at restricting digital marketing of breast milk substitutes. PAHO supports countries in the protection and promotion of breastfeeding and adherence to the standard infant feeding guidelines developed by the WHO. Following discussions at the Global Congress on the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, which was held in Geneva in June 2023, PAHO is now pursuing the implementation of the recommendations of the Congress to strengthen the protection of breastfeeding in the region. Many of the countries participating in this webinar also contributed to the Code Congress and presented a plan of action to enforce the implementation of the code, including corresponding legislation. Today, we will listen about how breastfeeding is considered a matter of human rights. We will also have an overview of breastfeeding practices in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we'll listen to some of the main results and recommendations from the Global Congress on the Code. Finally, we will be able to hear the experience on legislation across the region, as well as on implementation and monitoring of measures to regulate the marketing of breast milk substitutes. We welcome you all and look forward to an interesting meeting today with ideas about how to best implement the code in your countries and how PAHO and UNICEF can collaborate on your efforts. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Vanessa. Nuevamente a
Thank
todos
you
y
very
todas
much, Vanessa.
bienvenidos a este
Once
webinar.
again, welcome to
Vamos
all
a
to
tener
this
dos
webinar.
bloques de
We will have
presentaciones.
two groups of
Primero tenemos
presentations.
un bloque
First,
de
we have
presentaciones de los
presentations
especialistas
by
de
the
las agencias
specialists
UNICEF y
of
OPS,
the UNICEF
que
and
son
PAHO
presentaciones
organizations.
introductorias.
These will be
Y
introductory
después tenemos
presentations.
una sesión
Following
de
that,
preguntas
we
y
will have a session
respuestas. Y
questions
luego
and
pasamos
answers.
a un segundo bloque
And then we'll go
de
on to a
experiencias
second
de los
group
países en la
of
implementación del
experiences of the
código, donde
countries
vamos
in
a
implementing the code.
escuchar la
And we will
experiencia
hear
de El
the
Salvador y
experience
de
of El
Jamaica, y
Salvador and
nuevamente
Jamaica.
vamos a tener
And again,
una
we'll
pequeña
have
oportunidad de
a brief
responder
opportunity
a
to
algunas
respond
preguntas.
to
Contamos
questions.
con interpretación
We
simultánea,
have simultaneous interpretation
tanto
available.
de inglés a
It
español
is both
como
in
a
English,
portugués
Spanish,
y
and
al revés,
Portuguese,
digamos.
and
Entonces abajo en su pantalla
in
pueden
all
ver
three
un
languages.
globo
So in
que
your
dice
screen below at the bottom, you will see a
interpretación,
little
donde pueden
globe that
escoger
says
el
interpretation.
idioma
And there
en
you
el
can
que
choose the language
prefieren
you prefer
escuchar
to
este
listen
webinar.
in.
También para las preguntas hay una posibilidad en el QA de
In
hacer las
the
preguntas.
Q&A
Vamos a
section at the
tratar
bottom of
de
your screen,
responder algunas
you can also
preguntas
ask
ya
questions,
durante
and we
el
will try
webinar,
to respond to
y
some of the
si no,
questions
en
during the
el
webinar
bloque
itself.
de preguntas y
And if not,
respuestas.
we will do
Con
so during
esto
the Q&A
vamos a pasar
block.
a la primera presentación, que está a cargo de nuestro colega
Now we'll move on to the first presentation, which will be given by our colleague Olga Ignacio Gonzalez. He's regional advisor for human rights in the Pan American Health Organization, and he will talk to us about whether maternal breastfeeding is considered a human right. Go ahead, Olga.
No le escuchamos
Buenos días,
todavía.
¿me escuchan?
Ahora sí.
Gracias.
Yes, we can hear you
bonjour.
now. Thank you. Bonjour. Good morning to everyone. Buen día.
Me han pedido hablar de un tema muy interesante.
I have been asked to speak about a very interesting topic, so I'd like to thank Dr. Garcia Larsen and the team, and Dr. Nerdervin, and the rest of the team for having invited me to speak. I'd like to confirm that you can see my screen. Yes, but we can see it. You need to put it in presentation mode. We are seeing it in.
Permítanme un segundo. ¿Ahora?
Ahora sí.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias. Y un tema,
Thank you very much.
partiendo de una pregunta, es de la lactancia materna una
My
cuestión de
one
derechos
question
humanos.
is
Comienzo por el
maternal
final diciendo
breastfeeding,
que
a
sí
human
son
rights question.
decisoras.
I will begin with the end, by saying yes, there's no
Y no
question
voy a
about it.
entrar en
But I won't go
toda la
into
evidencia que
all
los demás
the
colegas
evidence that
van a
other
aportar.
colleagues will be
Todos
providing,
los estudios, todos
but
los datos
all
que
studies,
indican
all
la
data
recomendación
indicate
por parte de la OMS y de la
that
OPS
WHO and Pan
de
American Health
iniciar la
Organization
lactancia materna en la
recommend
primera
to
hora de vida y
start
mantenerla como la
breastfeeding during the
única
first hours of
alimentación
life
durante
and to
los 6
keep
meses
it as the
siguientes, y
only
toda la
uh,
recomendación que en esa
feeding during the
línea
6 months following.
voy a
And
evitar
all recommendations
hablar de eso para ir
derived from that,
directamente a
I
ver
won't speak
cómo
about,
es que
but
esto
I
ha
will speak
venido
more directly
cambiando y
about
evolucionando en
how
el
this
derecho
has
internacional de los
changed
derechos
and
humanos.
evolved
Y
in
si nos vamos
international
a
human
la
rights
propia
law.
Declaración Universal de
If
los
you go
Derechos
back to the
Humanos de
very Declaration of Human
1948,
Rights, which was
cuando
adopted
se
in
hablaba, se
1948,
empezaba a hablar no tanto de un derecho a la
when
salud, sino un
they
nivel de
talked not
vida
so much about
adecuada,
the
pero
right
ya
to
se
health,
hablaba de la
but the
salud, el
right to an
bienestar,
adequate
y
life.
en
But it
especial
did
la
refer to
alimentación,
health and
pero sí a la
well-being, in
maternidad y la
particular
infancia se le
feeding.
dio un lugar
And
preponderante en la propia
the
declaración, donde se hablaba
breastfeeding
del
was
derecho
given
a
a
los
very
cuidados y
important role
asistencia
where it spoke
especiales.
about the rights and
La
care and
declaración,
special
si la
attention.
mezclamos luego con
If you
todo el
look at the
avance en derechos
declaration,
civiles y
with
políticos
all
que se
the
va
progress that
regulando
took
en la
place
propia
in
declaración,
civil and
en el
political
Pacto
rights and
Internacional,
the
en la
Human
Convención
Rights
Americana y en otros
Declaration, the
instrumentos,
Inter-American
hay
Convention, and other
una
international
intrínseca
instruments,
relación de este
you
tema
see
con
that
los
there's a
derechos a la
very
vida, la
close
integridad
correlation
personal,
with this and the
la
right to
integridad
life, to
física, psíquica y
personal
emocional,
integrity,
a la igualdad y
physical,
no
psychic,
discriminación,
and
a los
emotional,
temas
as
de
well as
libertad de
equality,
personas relacionados con
non-discrimination,
el
and the
consentimiento
questions of
y
personal
particularmente el
freedom
acceso a la
related to
información.
consent,
Vamos a
and
ver por qué.
particularly access to information. And we will look at this in
Conectemos esto
particular.
con el derecho a la
Let's
salud,
now
tal como
link
está
this to the
reconocido
right to
en la
health,
Constitución de
which
la
has been
OMS,
recognized
la
in the
Carta de
World
la
Health
OEA, que es
Organization's
más
constitution,
tímida en la
the
definición,
OAS
en la
charter,
Declaración
which is a
Americana
bit more
también,
timid in
pero
this
vamos viendo cómo
definition,
avanzamos de
but you'll see how we
1946
move
y
from
1948
1946 to
a el
1948
reconocimiento que se le
to
da a la salud
the
en el Pacto de
specific
Derechos
recognition
Económicos,
given
Sociales y
to
Culturales de
health in the
1966
Declaration of
y repite
American
un poco
Declaration of
la
the Rights and Duties of Man
regulación
of
de,
1948, which
de la propia
repeats
Declaración Universal en
the
cuanto a nivel de vida
regulation of the
adecuado,
Universal Declaration
alimentación,
as to
pero
a
ya comienza a
adequate
hablar de la
level of
mejora
life,
continua de las condiciones de
food,
existencia,
and a
a
better
un derecho de toda persona
condition
estar
for
protegida
life.
contra el
And
hambre
it moves on
y
to the right to be
ya
protected
se
against
habla
hunger.
de la necesidad de
And,
que los
one
estados
of the
adopten
needs
medidas para mejorar métodos de
means that
producción,
states have to
etcétera,
provide
pero
measures to improve
además y
measures of
particularmente la
production,
divulgación de
but
principios
particularly
sobre
to
nutrición.
disseminate
Si a
principles
esto
on
sumamos ahora sí el
nutrition, to
derecho
inform about
a la
nutrition.
salud
And then if
reconocido en
we
el
add to that
pacto,
the
se
right of
habla de
to health,
medidas
which is
específicas
recognized
para la
by the
reducción de la
covenant, it
mortinatalidad
talks
y de la
about the specific
mortalidad infantil y
measures
el
to
sano desarrollo de los niños.
decrease mortality
Sumémosle a
and
esto un derecho
morbidity
muy
in
interesante y
children
muy complejo,
and the healthy development
bastante
of children.
olvidado por ahí, que se llama el
Another
derecho a
very
gozar de los
complex
beneficios
right
del, del
is the
progreso
right to
científico, o
enjoy the
también llamado del
benefits of
derecho a la
scientific
ciencia,
progress, or
reconocido en
also called
diferentes
the right to
instrumentos y
science,
tratados
as
internacionales.
spelled out in different
Y
international
agreguemos
documents and
ahora
instruments.
sí las
And to that,
especificaciones
then
de
we
los
have to add
tratados
the
o
specifications
instrumentos que hacen
included
protecciones más
in
específicas a derechos de las
more
mujeres o derechos de los
specific
niños.
protections
La convención
for
CEDAW,
protecting women and children.
sobre la eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación
The
contra la
Convention on
mujer
Elimination of
de
All Forms of Discrimination Against
1979
Women, adopted in
hablaba de esto, por
1979,
supuesto, del
spoke
punto de
about
vista de la
this
mujer,
from the
como
women's
en la
perspective.
garantía
And it
de los
said
servicios
that
apropiados
in
en relación con el
guaranteeing
embarazo,
appropriate
parto y
services
periodo posterior al
dealing with
parto,
pregnancy, delivery,
asegurando
and
una nutrición
postpartum,
adecuada durante la lactancia.
ensuring
Claro,
appropriate
ese es el
nutrition
enfoque hacia
during
la mujer.
pregnancy
Luego, en
and breastfeeding. So
1988,
that
el
focuses on the
protocolo de
women.
San
Then
Salvador en
in
la Convención
1988, the
Americana,
San
que ese sí
Salvador
regula
Protocol
derechos
to the
económicos,
American
sociales y culturales,
Convention,
y
which
ya
is one
reconoce
that
la salud
governs
como un bien público,
cultural
habla de la
rights,
necesidad de que los
and
estados
speaks as
adopten
health
medidas
is a
para la
public good,
educación
and
de la
talks about the
población
need
sobre
to
la
educate the
prevención y
population on the
tratamiento de los
prevention and
problemas de salud.
treatment of health
La
problems.
satisfacción, además de las
It also
necesidades
says
de
that
salud de los grupos con más
to
alto riesgo y
satisfy,
que
in
por sus
addition to the
condiciones de
needs
pobreza sean
of
más vulnerables.
groups that
Aquí
are
ya
at
vamos
higher
usando
risk
un
and
tema
more
adicional
vulnerable
que
because of
es la
poverty.
situación
And
de
here it
vulnerabilidad
refers
de
to,
muchísimas
and it's
personas
added
en
this concept of
subsistencia.
the
La
vulnerability
Convención
of
sobre los
people.
Derechos del Niño de
Then the Convention on the Rights of Children, adopted in 1989, does specifically talk about the right to health, to combat disease and malnutrition. taken into account in addition to receiving adequate nutritional food and taking into account the risks caused by pollution, environmental pollution. It also asks the state to ensure that all sectors of society, in particular parents and children, recognize the basic principles of health and nutrition for children, including breastfeeding. Then we go on to other international regulations within the framework of the International Labor Organization in Convention 183 of the year 2000 on protection motherhood. It says that the protection of maternity has been recognized by the ILO since 1959, and in Agreement from 1952, and in Agreement 102 on social protection. But this one, 183, is particularly important because it not only establishes to protect and safeguard the health of the mother, the child, but also to protect the female worker against discrimination caused by her condition. So knowing that pregnancy is not a disease and work can represent a risk for a pregnant woman, and there are risks associated with it, for the very first time, ILO recognizes the right to protect the health of the woman in the labor, in the work environment, and talks about the right to breastfeed children after returning to work as an important part of protecting motherhood and maternity. There's some other regional and universal instruments that have a relation to this, such as racism, racial discrimination, or even the rights of the disabled. WHO, when it adopted the very important international code on the marketing of breastfeeding substitutes that promoted breastfeeding and was adopted by the World Health Organization in 1981, is a standard of protection to encourage adequate feeding of the infant. So there are a series of recommendations to regulate the breastfeeding of breast milk, including feeding bottles and teats. It includes an expression on the part of the government to encourage optimal feeding of infants and establishes general conditions that allow mothers to have access to information and deals with the improper marketing of food products that compete with maternal breastfeeding. The code establishes a series of expressions, as you know, on information, education, promotion of substitutes, milk substitutes, and the quality labeling and surveillance. One other important topic, as we know, is that the Assembly has adopted since 1981 a series of resolutions pertaining to the marketing and use of milk substitutes that expand the use of the code. And it gives a series of examples, for instance, to update the recommendation to having exclusive breastfeeding up until 6 months, to ensure that there are no statements made about nutrition and health on milk substitutes, and appropriate inappropriate promotion of food, and that all this has to be considered as a whole when implementing national measures. The other colleagues will be talking about how the code is being implemented, and here we have some figures from the latest status report for the Americas region on the national implementation of this code. And you can see progress has been made. There's still a lot to be done. Let's add to this, within the framework of PAHO, we have the very broad resolution on human rights which recognizes this as a conceptual and legal binding framework for health strategies, and which urges states to review and reformulate national plans and legislation on health. And that is combined with the other strategy of PAHO on legislation pertaining to health that urges states to adopt, implement, or review legal or regulatory frameworks, policies, and other provisions as appropriate. So we can see how there's a broad interpretation by international bodies monitoring and surveillance of the obligations of states in implementing human rights. And so this brings us to the Committee on the Rights of the Child in the observation 7, when it talks about the realization of the child's rights in early infancy, which was adopted in 2006. And it develops a responsibility that states have to make effective the right to health of children, infants, children, and adolescents. Particularly, it speaks about the advantage of breastfeeding. And then in the observation 16 of adopted 2013 on the impact this has on the business sector, it very specifically says, when talking about legislative, regulatory, and application measures, it very specifically emphasizes the obligation that states have to apply and enforce international agreed to standards on the rights of the child, health, and business world. And it specifically refers to the International Code and the adoption, the resolutions adopted by the World Health Assembly. If we add to this the SDGs for 2030, we see that SDG 2, 3, and 4, and 8 have a very specific reference to protecting breastfeeding. It also talks about the benefit to a national economy. It helps to reduce the cost of healthcare and therefore increases the productivity. Again, this was analyzed by the World Bank. And we know that in the rates of lower breastfeeding lead to lower productivity and more health problems, which mean millions of dollars. In 2016, there was a joint statement by several human rights bodies, the special rapporteurs of the UN on the right to food, the right to health, the working group on discrimination against women, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and very specifically referred to breastfeeding as a human rights issue. This is perhaps the clearest and most direct reference until now on the answer to the question. And it says specifically, breastfeeding is a human rights issue for both the child and the mother. And here it then explains how it benefits the mother, how it benefits the child. And as I was saying earlier, it incorporates the rights in the effort to life, development, survival, health, and it explains how breastfeeding is an integral component. And for women, it says they have the right to information, to autonomy, and to make their own decisions. This is perhaps the document that best develops, most strongly develops from the perspective of the United Nations, the right to breastfeeding, and identifies as an obstacle the disinformation provided by companies that produce milk substitutes. And it talks about the lack of corporate responsibility, and if you put this, it gives you specific numbers as to the earnings by corporations on breast milk substitutes, and explains the reason why this business is so aggressive. It also says that states need to adopt the measures to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. and end the inappropriate promotion of breast milk substitutes. And it also emphasizes the access to information so that a woman can make an informed decision concerning the optimal nutrition for her child, and that this is an obligation of the hardcore human right. I also would like to mention that the rapporteurs also make a specific reference to international powers and the effort that states need to continue carrying out establishes the benefits of breastfeeding, and it refers to the code. When the national courts are brought forth issues that refer to this, we see that, for instance, the Colombian Constitutional Court talks about motherhood is includes breastfeeding, and establishes that there must be a protection in the work environment of the woman, and it considers the pregnant woman and the infant and the right to be fed during work, all the conditions for firing something, the conditions for ensuring legal protection of the woman, and the right that the woman has the right to breastfeed her child, and this must be done by, in its countries they have different words, but a breastfeeding room or a family room, or they also have the Supreme Court of Justice of Costa Rica that again refers to a very broad framework to protect the right of the working woman who is pregnant or breastfeeding and her child, and talks about a right of a child to be breastfed by its mother and protect the right to enjoy optimal nutrition. In addition to the analysis of the national laws, it says that there's also international framework and on breastfeeding, and it refers to what UNICEF, ACNUR have done, and the UNICEF and the code itself. It makes a specific reference to the code. There's this other series of developments, for instance, the World Alliance for Breastfeeding Action that speaks about, in a very interesting way, speaks about that breastfeeding contributes to the health of all women and reduce the risk of acquiring diseases. The National Mexican Council and Federation talks about dignified breastfeeding as a right, and it further develops these issues. There's also the Department of Health of the state of New York in the United States. It has a Declaration of the Rights of Mothers to breastfeed. And another very interesting topic is that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, in a very recent report last year, 2023, developed in a very broad manner the question of non-communicable diseases and human rights in the Americas, and strongly emphasizes what has been accomplished through WHO and Pan American Health Organization. And you can see here, when studying the impact and the vulnerability, expresses its concern for stunting of children, resulting a very high, which is very high in rural areas and very poor areas where there's low levels of schooling, and that it's important therefore to encourage breastfeeding and facilitate an access to healthy food.
Regarding marketing of these breast milk substitutes, it talks about the hurdles that prevent breastfeeding and the measures that ought to be adopted in order to enforce the international code. It talks about the network created by WHO. It identifies in a way the issue that we already know. 19 countries in the region have approved provisions about the implementation of the international code, but only 8 countries have included all the provisions of the code in the national legislation, and mentioning PAHO and UNICEF and WHO. And it shows how in some countries it is underlining how they are aligned, others in a moderate way, and others without any alignment with the code. And they stress this so that later on, in turn, it can stress how some countries have moved forward in an interesting way, such as Chile and Ecuador, with guidelines and provisions. In Argentina, the health and nutrition poll, which include data on breastfeeding. And this is how we start seeing how the Inter-American Commission offers recommendations to states, prevention, monitoring, supervision, related to the respect for human rights within the framework of business ideas, including extraterritorial fields. And in a way, it sort of questions the advantage or the good thing of the concept of social responsibility and does not replace the provisions of corporate responsibility. You have to come to an end because we're running out of time. I will conclude this in 30 seconds. Simply to say thank you very much. And I just want to say that to speak about free of conflict of interest at the best experience, the best evidence, and to promote anti-corruption mechanisms and access to information on matters of health, which includes the one that has to do with nutritional content. And there's a specific recommendation of states in order to deal with the structural barriers. And amongst these, we have gender inequalities, regulation of care provisions, and it strongly supports the implementation of the measures within the framework of the code. So if we have the obligations of the states to respect, to guarantee, to prevent the rights that we've already seen in connection with the right to health and to adopt internal measures, and we go to what the World Day for the Protection of Breastfeeding is, which is this year, is for my rights, marketing of a breastfeed, and we can see that the status report that in this score is published gives us a very clear recommendation during this World Breastfeeding Protection Day, even for the states that have not recognized the code, that have not owned the obligations contained in the international code, the international right to human rights, and the agreements and conventions, international agreements and conventions, which are an appropriate framework in order to deal with all these issues in such a way that we not only depend on the code, but all the international norms of human rights that support what is stated in the code. And in any case, we saw how the protection bodies protect this, all the work that has been done. Thank you very much for the invitation once again, and greetings to everyone. Thank you very much, Olga, for stressing the importance of human rights and also that this is a human right of children, but also of women, because there are also benefits both for the children as well as for women in promoting breastfeeding. So let us now move on to the next presentation. Perhaps we should also say that we already have a few questions. So Olga, if you can please answer the questions on the chat. And I'd like you to know that after the event, on that same webpage where you registered for this event, you will be able to find the recording of the event as well as the presentations. But for the time being, let us now move on and let us listen to Michelle Alvarez Garcia. She is a specialist in food systems from the regional UNICEF office, and she will be presenting the situation, the general situation with breastfeeding in Latin America and the Caribbean. So please, Michelle, go ahead. Thank you very much, Leo. Could you please confirm that you can see the slides? Yes, we can.
Ok, perfecto.
Muy bien.
Muchísimas gracias, Leo.
Yes,
y gracias
perfect.
por la-
Thank you very
la
much, Leo, and
presentación.
thank you,
Muchísimas gracias a
Ignacio and
todos
Vanessa, for the
ustedes. Tenemos
presentation, and thank you to each and every
alrededor de
one of you.
470
We have
personas conectadas. Muchas gracias por
470
haberse
people
unido en
connected. Thank
un
you
día
very
tan
much for
importante
joining
como
us
es
in
el
such an
Día
important
Mundial de la
day,
Protección de la
such
Lactancia
as
Materna.
this day, which is the
Entonces,
World
para
Day
iniciar
for
esta
Breastfeeding
presentación,
Protection.
quisiera
So in order to
comenzar mostrando el
get this
panorama del
going,
Estado
I'd like
Nacional de la
to show
Niñez
you
en
the
los 5
status
años en América Latina
of
y el Caribe. Como
breastfeeding
podemos ver
in
en el
children
mapa
under
que
5 in
dice la
Latin
doble
America and the
carga de la
Caribbean, and we see
malnutrición
the double
caracterizada
burden
por índices de
of
sobrepeso infantil
malnutrition
por
because
encima de la media
of
global
the
de 8.6
weight
y
above 8.6
6.6%
against
y desnutrición
5.6% above
crónica.
the average mean, and
Como
chronic
vemos en los círculos, los
malnutrition.
círculos
And as we
amarillos
see in
corresponden a
these
la
dots, the
desnutrición
yellow dots,
crónica
they
y los
represent
círculos
chronic
azules al
malnutrition,
sobrepeso y
and
la
blue
obesidad.
shows
A pesar de que la
overweight and
desnutrición
obesity. In
crónica
spite of the fact that
desmejora la
chronic
media mundial,
malnutrition
esta sigue
is
siendo,
under the
sigue estando
world
por encima
average,
del
it
10% en
continues
varios
to be
países,
above 10%
sobrepasa
in
el
some
20 y el
countries, and it goes
40%,
beyond 20 and
especialmente en dos
40%,
países de la región.
particularly in 2 countries in the
Aquí
region.
podemos ver
And
un
here
poco las
we can
tendencias, a
see,
pesar de
in
que
a
la
way, the
desnutrición
trends,
crónica ha
in
ido en
spite of the fact that
disminución.
chronic
En los últimos
malnutrition
10
has
años
been
podemos ver que
dropping
la
in the
disminución ha
last 10
ido
years. So we can
poco
see
a
that
poco,
this
que
drop has
aún
been
debemos
taking
de
place little
acelerar los
by little.
esfuerzos para
So we
continuar
still have
reduciéndola.
to step
Por
up
otro
the
lado,
efforts in
vemos
order to
cómo
continue
el
on the
porcentaje del
downslope.
sobrepeso infantil
And we
en
see
niños y niñas
how the
menores de
percentage
5
of
años
average weight in children
continúa
under 5
aumentando de una manera
continues
acelerada y
to rise
preocupante,
in a
ya que
concerning
los
and
niños y niñas
accelerated way, because
en esta
children,
edad,
boys and girls in this
su
age
alimentación está
group,
empezando a verse
their
afectada por el alto
nutrition is
consumo de
being
alimentos y
affected by the high
sustancias
consumption
processadas.
of ultra-processed food
Sabemos
and
que la lactancia
beverages.
materna,
We know that
a
breastfeeding
partir de los 6 meses y
is
a
starting at
continuadas
the
a
age
los
of
8
6
meses,
months, and it continues
fundamental
until
para
the age of
garantizar
2,
una
is
nutrición
essential
adecuada y
to have
prevenir todas las
adequate
formas de la
nutrition and to
malnutrición.
prevent all forms of malnutrition.
Pero realmente, ¿cómo estamos en América Latina y el Caribe?
But how are we doing
Como
in Latin
estaba
America and
mencionando
the
Ignacio, en
Caribbean?
algún
As Ignacio
momento,
was saying at
la
some point,
OMS y UNICEF recomienda el
WHO and
inicio
UNICEF
temprano de la lactancia
recommend
materna en la
the
primera hora de
beginning of
vida.
breastfeeding during the first
Esto
hour of
beneficia a todos
life,
los
and
recién
this
nacidos
benefits
sin importar su
all
contexto,
newborns,
ayudando a su
irrespective of their
supervivencia, a
context,
su salud
helping
y
in
a
their
su adecuado
survival, their
desarrollo.
health,
Sin
and their
embargo,
adequate
como vemos en
development.
la
However,
gráfica,
as we can see
únicamente
on the chart,
uno de cada dos niños, el
only 1 out of 2
55% de
children,
niños y
it's
niñas menores,
55% of
inician la
children
lactancia materna
begin
en la primera hora de
breastfeeding
vida
during the first
y
hour of
únicamente el
life, and only
62% la inicia en
62%
las primeras
begin
48 horas.
breastfeeding during the first 48 hours.
En algunos casos, la falta de apoyo de los
In
servicios
some
de
cases, the
salud,
lack of
la
support by
separación
health
temprana de las
services,
madres de sus bebés,
early
así como la
detachment
falta de
from
conocimiento
mothers
de
and
personal de
babies,
salud
as well as the
en
lack of
relación a los
knowledge by health
beneficios
personnel in
del
connection with
inicio
the
temprano de la
benefits
lactancia
of
materna,
the early
como
beginning
algunas
of
prácticas
breastfeeding, as
socioculturales
well
que
as some social
dificultan esta
cultural
práctica.
practices make it very difficult to continue with this
Creo
practice.
que no nos vamos a cansar de decirlo,
I believe that
lactancia
we will
materna
never tire in
exclusiva
saying this
hasta los 6
exclusive
meses es
breastfeeding up
fundamental
to
para
the
el
age of
adecuado
6 months
crecimiento y
is
desarrollo de
essential
todos
for
los
adequate
niños
growth and
niños
development of
del
all
mundo, sin
children
importar
all
su
over the
estado
world,
socioeconómico o su
irrespective of their
contexto. Sin
socioeconomic
embargo, vemos
context.
que esta práctica es
However, we
únicamente
see
el
that this practice is
43%
only
en los niños y niñas de
43%
América Latina y
in
del Caribe.
children in Latin
Esto está
America and the
por
Caribbean.
debajo
And this
de la
is
tasa global de
below the
48
global
8%.
rate of
Vemos
48%.
cómo algunas,
We see
la
how
introducción
in
temprana
some,
de
the early
alimentos y
introduction
bebidas,
of food and
así como
beverages, as well
algunas prácticas
as some
socioculturales
social cultural
y las
practices
presiones sociales y
and
laborales
social
dificultan esta
work
práctica.
pressures
También la
that make
interferencia de
it
la
difficult
industria en el
to
que vamos a
continue with
hablar un
this, and
poco
the
más
preference of the
adelante,
industry, and
también
we will
están
go into this
dificultando esta
later on,
práctica.
are also hampering this practice.
En este mapa podemos ver más
On this
específicamente cómo
map,
están
we
las
can see
prácticas de
more
lactancia
specifically
materna
the
exclusivas para
practices
6
on
meses en los distintos
exclusive
países.
breastfeeding up to the age of
Podemos
6
ver
months
cómo
in
en
the
algunos
different countries.
países esta
And we
práctica es
can see
todavía
how in these
menor
countries
y
this
al
practice is even
33%,
less,
siendo entre
under
20 a
43%.
30%.
It goes from 20 to 39%.
A partir de los 6 meses,
Starting
la
at the age
lactancia
of 6
materna
months,
hasta los 2
breastfeeding
años
up
y
to the age of
después de
2,
los 2 años
and
continúa
even
generando
after the
grandes
age of 2,
beneficios tanto para
continues
los
offering great benefits
niños y niñas como para
for
las madres
children as well as
y
for
continúa
the
siendo
mothers.
una
It
fuente
continues
importante de
to be an
nutrientes.
important source of
Sin embargo,
nutrients.
vemos que esta
However,
práctica
we
es
see that this
únicamente el
practice
48%
is
en
only a
América Latina
48%
y
in
el
Latin
Caribe,
America and the Caribbean.
que está muy por debajo
It is
de la
far
tasa global de
below the global
59%.
rate of 59%. As Ignacio was saying previously, strengthening regulatory frameworks aligned with the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes is essential to ensure adequate nutrition, promoting breastfeeding. But how are we doing with the enforcement of the code in Latin America and the Caribbean? The 35 countries, out of these, only 19 have adopted legal measures that consider some of the provisions of the code. And based on the points assigned in connection with the provisions included, we see that only 2 countries are completely aligned to the code. 16 countries in the region do not have any legal measure, and 8 only some legal measures aligned with the code. On this slide, we can clearly see how we're doing when compared to other regions. We see that we are the second region after Europe that has less countries aligned with the code. And therefore, we clearly see that there's a long way to go. And here we can see on this slide, we can see in greater detail the summary of how some of the provisions of the code have been included in national legal measures in some countries. We can see, as you can tell by the red arrows, that only 2 countries have adopted measures in order to cover the whole gamut of substitutes until the age of 36 months. So we can see how only 2 countries have included measures in order to ban educational materials by the industry, educational materials that suggest the promotion of breast milk substitutes. And something that is striking in this region is that the inclusion of measures or the lack of regulation for incentives and rewards are given to health professionals, including meetings, trips, events, and funding for research. I'm trying to go on to the next screen. As we saw on the previous slide, we clearly have a way to go in order to strengthen regulatory frameworks in Latin America and the Caribbean. However, there are major challenges to be faced, as were mentioned by Ignacio. One of them is aggressive promotion of commercial substitutes, including digital media and the use of artificial intelligence. We see how the industry is far ahead of these policies, and this is something that we have to consider when we beef up the regulatory frameworks. Another one of the challenges, as we saw on the previous slide, is the absence of regulatory frameworks or the obsolete condition of robust regulatory measures for the protection and promotion of breastfeeding. Then we see the interference of the industry in key decision-making spaces, and also interference by the industry in the health sector from universities, health centers, hospitals, and ministries, as well as the interference in generating evidence with conflict of interest. Some of the recommendations for the promotion and protection of breastfeeding, the first one would be to review the update of the report of the code, the status of the code that will be launched this week, to identify the gaps that exist in the different countries in order to update the regulatory frameworks in keeping with the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, to acknowledge the obligation of states in order to guarantee the rights of the children, and to see all the different frameworks that are presented, which emphasize how breastfeeding is a situation of human rights, and it has to do with the human rights of children. So we should do everything possible so that governments will guarantee these rights. Also, we ought to examine and consider the new promotion techniques, including digital media, including broad definitions for the different means of promotion and publicity of breast milk substitutes. We should strengthen advocacy to expedite the implementation of the code, to assign financial and human resources, not only to strengthen the regulatory frameworks, but also to monitor these adequately. On the other hand, it is essential to act without a conflict of interest and to promote the spaces for advocacy free of conflicts of interest in order to support adequate and safe nutrition in small children as well as in infants. And to conclude, it is necessary to continue joining efforts with academia, with civil society, and with United Nations agencies in order to support governments in order to ensure the rights of children to adequate and safe nutrition, promoting breastfeeding through the implementation and adequate monitoring of the Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank PAHO for continuing to work with us in this very important agenda, and also thank you for the invitation.
Muchas gracias, Michelle.
Thank you
por
very
esta
much, Michelle,
interesante
for this
presentación.
interesting
Definitivamente
presentation.
muy pertinente también las
Very relevant.
recomendaciones porque el panorama
Also, all the recommendations, because
ha cambiado bastante
the
desde
situation
que
has changed
se
drastically
aprobó el Código
ever
Internacional
since
de
the
Lactancia
International
Materna.
Code
Hubo
for
muchas
breastfeeding was
resoluciones
approved. There
posteriores
were
y
several resolutions
ahora
that
también
came up
los
later
medios
on,
digitales
and
han
now digital
cambiado
media
todo el
that are
panorama
changing the
y
entire
hay
situation,
definitivamente
and
necesidad
it
por más
continues to
abogacía
show
para
us that there's a
actualizar las
need, is
legislaciones,
irrespective of
incluir
the
los
advocacy
nuevos
to ensure
elementos y
the
también por
legislation and the
tener
regulations also for
sanciones
new food,
claras.
and in order to have
Seguimos
clear
con Audrey
sanctions. And
Morris
now we
de la
move on to
OPS,
Audrey
es
Morris
asesora
from
regional
PAHO. She's a
en
regional
alimentación y
advisor
nutrición
in
y nos va a hablar
food and nutrition, and she
del
will be talking
Congreso
about
Mundial sobre la
the Global Congress
implementación del
on the
Código
implementation of the
de
International Code
Sucedáneos
of
de la
marketing
leche
of
materna.
breast milk
Adelante,
substitutes.
Audrey.
Please, Audrey.
Good morning. Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes. Just a reminder for all participants, if they have questions, if they can please put them in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that reminder. Okay, so following on the presentations that we have had so far this morning, I'm going to be presenting on the Global Congress on Implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. And this is a congress which was held last year in Geneva. I'll skip that. Maybe I shouldn't. To remind you, the International Code is a set of recommendations to regulate the marketing meaning promotion and sale of breast milk substitutes, feeding bottles, and teats. And it was adopted by the World Health Assembly in 1981. It's required as a minimum requirement to protect breastfeeding. And since 1982, the World Health Assembly has since adopted at least 20 resolutions, maybe more by now, to clarify the code and to keep it up to date with marketing trends and scientific knowledge. So when we speak about the code, it includes the code and the subsequent resolutions. And I want to make that point because very often representatives from marketing companies, for example, will tell you that the code is outdated. These World Health Assembly resolutions are what are used to update the code on average every 2 years. So when we speak about the code, we must remember that we are also including these resolutions. We have seen so far this morning that of the 35 countries in the Americas, only 19 have adopted some legal measures to implement at least some of the provisions in the code. And I can tell you that only 2 countries, as Michelle mentioned, Brazil and Panama, have measures in place that are substantially aligned with the code. So unfortunately, we have 16 countries yet to enact any legal measures on the code. These are the countries you can see here. Brazil and Panama substantially aligned. We have several countries which are regarded as moderately aligned, and that is by the process, the criteria used by WHO and UNICEF and IFBAN, and some provisions, you'll see the countries listed there. But of course, we have the 16 countries which have no legal status of the code. And those are all countries who do not have full implementation of the code. We would be very concerned about, but we are especially concerned about these who have no legal status at all of the code. And we do know that some countries are moving towards the implementation of the code, some of the countries listed there. So the Code Congress was held from 20 to 22nd June in Geneva. The objectives really, bearing in mind the issues which have been outlined, the objectives were to increase knowledge and skills of the national actors on strategies to end the unethical marketing of breast milk substitutes, bottles, and teats, to develop national roadmaps to strengthen implementation of the code, to build regional networks to share information and support for national action on the code. So the themes of the Code Congress, you can see them listed there, and I will go through each of them in a couple of minutes. We had 26 participating countries from the Americas, and we are happy that these countries were able to participate. It took some doing, but with the help of several entities, WHO, UNICEF, PAHO, and others, several countries were able to participate in this important event. So the first theme that was reviewed, what was included, was building political will. The discussions there centered around breastfeeding as a human right, which we have heard about this morning, the fact that breastfeeding is constantly challenged, and the whole issue of digital marketing. What's going to be done about it? Do countries have the political will to actually do something about like digital marketing, which really, remember I said the code was agreed by the World Health Assembly in 1981. So digital marketing would not have been an issue at that time. No, it is probably the most prevalent form of marketing of breast milk substitutes. The second theme was identifying and managing industry interference. They talked about the industry playbook. And the playbook includes the disinformation tactics, such as fake research, diversions, buying credibility. So companies try to buy credibility through forming alliances with academia and professional associations, and through the manipulation of government officials and processes, unfortunately. And it was noted that the tactics being used apply not only to infant formula and baby food, but it is similar to what is used for tobacco, pharmaceutical drugs, food, and ultra-processed products. So this is a widespread use of this playbook that they have. There was group work interspersed throughout the days of the Congress. So in this first breakout session, there was a focus on this industry interference to really sensitize participants and help them understanding that they need to protect the policy, protect government processes from interference. So in these scenarios were used, so the group work participants were presented with scenarios which they dissected. They looked at what they could do in their countries to prevent industry interference. What could they do? What were the existing mechanisms, and what additional mechanisms are needed? The next theme was on implementing the code international law. So the focus here was on understanding the code. There are several tools that help to do that, and those were presented. And countries, of course, they have the code, but they also have other international and national laws and treaties, such as what Olga mentioned earlier. Moving on to theme 4, which is strengthening coordination and governance mechanisms in national laws. So there were observations made from implementing laws and policies in the health sector. What are the steps to strengthening governance during policy development? And again, each of these had group work sessions so that the participants actually could get a feel for how they can approach these issues in their countries. The next theme was monitoring and enforcing the code laws. So building and strengthening national monitoring and enforcement mechanisms. There were presentations on that. Grassroots monitoring. So the assistance of entities at the grassroots, who are working at the grassroots, what they can do, what they were doing. The whole issue of monitoring of the digital marketing, which has become so important now with this new development. And there were country experiences for this particular one. There were experiences from Brazil, from our region. So the final theme was really, having heard all of this, what do countries need to do? So take action. So in this session, countries began to make concrete action plan. They looked at the opportunities for change. For example, were there upcoming political opportunities for them to progress the code in their countries? So for example, is there a national strategy being renewed? Is the political leadership being changed in a short while? And how can this affect the code implementation in the country? Budget reviews, would there be something in the budget? Can there be a lobby for enough in the budget to do this? Parliamentary bills, political interest in consumer protection, for example. And then there's a power mapping. Who can create the change? So there's a mapping of the actors involved and whether they support or oppose progress. And importantly then, the country representatives were asked to devise some SMART commitments. Now, these were not commitments of the country. They weren't in a position to do this. But then how would they see these developments taking place when they go home? And what would need to be done in the short term, within the next 6 months, or within the next 2 years in the longer term? So some of the key messages overall, as we have heard today, the marketing of commercial milk formulas is pervasive, personalized, and powerfully effective. And I would invite you to look at these 2 reports, which we have on the PAHO website. And they look at the strategies, their WHO reports that look at the strategies used by the formula industry, just as the pharmaceutical, alcohol, and tobacco industries have used. There are new modes of advertising and sophisticated marketing techniques that amplify and exploit parents' concerns and vulnerabilities related to infant feeding. So, as I said, I invite you to look at those reports. It was also brought home, and very often you hear this question, how has the code made a difference? And what we can see from these 2 graphics here, that the rates of breastfeeding are highest in countries where the laws are aligned with the code. So on the left, you see the percentage of infants 0 to 5 months old exclusively breastfed by code status. So where there are no legal measures there's a lower percentage of infants being exclusively breastfed, and this increases in the countries which are substantially aligned with the code. So there's a gradual progression. And the same thing is seen with the percentage of children 20 to 23 months, so that is continued breastfeeding at 20 to 23 months, where there are no legal measures. There's definitely a lower percentage of these children with continued breastfeeding compared with the countries where there's substantial alignment of the laws with the code. So the code does make a difference. I really do want to stress that. I'm following on the key messages of the Congress. The implementation of the code is a core obligation under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other relevant UN human rights instruments. And we heard extensively about that in the first presentation. Countries must safeguard the policy process from industry interference. Also, the effective code legislation must be multisectoral, and it should clearly delineate the roles and responsibilities and, very importantly, allocate adequate financing. There must be fines and penalties. So very often, what happens when there's an infraction of the code, a letter is written to the company or whatever other entity has not complied with the code, and it's regarded really as if there's no legislation, there can be no punitive action. So writing a letter and asking them to discontinue really is not very helpful, and it is not effective. Laws must be put in place with fines. So UNICEF and WHO have pledged their support to countries for a successful implementation of the code, providing technical guidance, advocacy and awareness raising, in policy development and the legal frameworks, capacity building, enforcement and penalties, monitoring and compliance, fostering collaboration and partnerships. Who are the other entities that need to be involved in this? So it's not just ministries of health. It's a legal issue, so we need those partners as well. We need NGOs who have an interest in this and a positive interest in this. There's also the need to facilitate knowledge sharing and exchanging and building networks. And one of the things that we want to do in this region, UNICEF and PAHO together, we are looking at the formation of code networks where we can exchange ideas, exchange new information, keep informed on what is going on and what needs to happen in the legislation and monitoring of the code. So those networks should come into fruition by the end of the year. We're also at PAHO mapping the legislation in Caribbean countries. When I showed you those 16 countries that have no legislation, the majority of them were Caribbean countries, and that's something that we need to work on in what are the points of entry in the existing laws that countries can use to, if not having an entire code law, but at least to have aspects of the code's articles in their laws. After that, we will prepare a manual or some kind of a framework to assist countries in this national legislation and, of course, assist the countries in preparing their laws. Those countries which have developed their laws some time ago, or even recently, there are sometimes some gaps which have been identified, and these need to be strengthened. Okay, and that is something we can work with countries too. to do, as well as continued support for monitoring of code implementation. And of course, we all will continue our advocacy and capacity building. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Audrey. We are a little bit behind, but there are a few questions. So let me first ask a question to Olger, and you can respond live. And then I have a question for Michelle and then for Audrey as well. So, Olger, hay una pregunta o tal vez puedes responder dos
There's
preguntas
a
en
question.
una.
Maybe you can answer two
Una
questions
está
in one. The first
relacionado
question
a
has to
lo que
do
se puede hacer
with
en Mercosur
what
o
can be
tal vez en
done in
general en los
Mercosur or in general
organismos,
in
digamos, descentralizados, los
the
organismos subregionales,
decentralized
digamos, que se puede hacer
bodies, or
en cuanto a regulación
more
del
specifically the
código, ¿no?
sub-regional bodies that
Y
can,
también
what can be
alguna
done about
pregunta
regulating the
si
code.
se necesitan
And
nuevos
another
elementos
question is, do we
legislativos
new
internacionales que sean
international
obligatorios para lograr
legislation
este
that is
propósito? Tal
binding or
vez
mandatory in
brevemente
order to
puedes
achieve this?
abordar
Could
estas
you
preguntas.
address these two questions,
Muchas gracias. ¿Me
please?
escuchan?
Thank you very much.
Sí.
Can you hear me?
Perfecto.
Yes.
¿Qué posibilidad existe de incluir en
What
Mercosur?
is the
Yo lo
possibility
llevaría esa
of
pregunta
including
no
this
solo a
in
Mercosur,
Mercosur?
lo
I would
llevaría
take
a
that
los
question
sistemas de
not just
integración
to Mercosur,
centroamericana,
but to
al
the Central
sistema
American Integration
CARICOM,
System and to
y
CARICOM.
los sistemas,
I would
digamos,
ask
subregionales
these
que
sub-regional
establecen formas de
entities
mercados
who have
comunes
established
centroamericanos
common markets, like the Central American
avanzar
Common Market.
en
I'd ask
línea con lo que
them
establece
to
el Código
move
Internacional
forward
de las
in line
Recomendaciones
with the
Técnicas,
international code
creo que es
on
la
the
OMS,
technical
y el
recommendations that have been
Internacional de
adopted,
los
PAHO
Derechos
and
Humanos
WHO,
como
and
normas
international
superiores en
law,
esta materia,
and
estamos hablando de la
these
Convención
be
de Derechos
the
Humanos. Es decir,
governing
sí
legislation
se
on
puede trabajar
matters pertaining
en
to
estos
human rights. In other words,
organismos,
yes, you
en
can
la medida
work
que,
through these bodies
claro, los objetivos de
as
organismos
long
como
as
Mercosur, como
the
SICA, como
goals
CARICOM,
of
que tienen además la
Mercosur or
finalidad
SICA or
de
CARICOM,
favorecer
whose
comercio
main purpose is
regional,
to
bienes,
encourage
servicios,
international trade of goods and
esto,
services.
en la medida en que se acoplen y se
But
integren
if
estas
they're
obligaciones
able to
internacionales,
incorporate these
claro,
international
se
obligations,
puede avanzar
then
y se
and
debe
in the
avanzar
national
rápido.
legislation,
Es decir,
then
creo
they
que
can
el sentido de
move
todo lo
forward
que
in
se
adopting
establece
this.
en las
I
políticas
think
subregionales
anything
de
that is
promoción del
adopted
comercio
in
internacional
a
regulaciones
regional
comunitarias
policy to
va a ser
regulate trade
muy favorable
will
siempre que esté en línea con
be
las normas de orden superior
helpful as
de
long as
derechos
it's
humanos.
consistent
La
and
pregunta es si necesitamos nuevos elementos
with the
legislativos.
international laws.
Yo podría pensar que
The
tenemos
question as to whether we
todo
need
bueno,
new
tenemos
legislative instruments. I
internacionales
think we have
que
very good
tienen
ones already in existence.
interpretados armónicos
We have
sistemáticamente
international
en
systems that
estatutos
have been
que nos permiten
harmoniously
defender,
interpreted by
resguardar,
everyone.
proteger,
And what we need to
garantizar los
do
derechos
is
de las
protect,
mujeres
safeguard
y de
the
los
rights
niños,
of
niñas en
women,
lactancia.
children
Y
in
tenemos
breastfeeding.
un muy sólido
And we do
instrumento
also
que es
have
el
a
Código
very
Internacional
solid
Boliviano,
instrument, the
que
international
tiene
code,
además
that
interpretaciones
in
subsecuentes,
addition
que
has
tiene
had
además
subsequent interpretations to it
efectivas
and
todo este
subsequent
conjunto.
pronouncements.
Yo podría
So that
pensar que
whole
tenemos
series
un marco
of
internacional muy sólido
legislation
para
we have,
seguir
I think,
trabajando en
means
eso.
that we
Por lo
have
tanto,
very solid
muchos
international
datos,
legislation
pero
to
tampoco quiero decir
continue our
que
work.
sí.
So I don't
Creo
want to say
creo
no,
que los
but I don't
marcos
want to say yes
internacionales
either.
que
I think the
tenemos
international
son
instruments we have
sólidos,
are
son,
solid,
tienen un amplio desarrollo,
have
tienen
been
unas interpretaciones
developed
y una evidencia
widely,
técnica,
and they have
científica que
technical,
sustenta su mayor
scientific
aplicación y
evidence
que
that
además obliga a
support
los estados
greater
a
application of them,
actualizar sus
and
normativas,
which
sus prácticas a nivel
urge
nacional.
states to review their own laws and legislation and their
Muchas
practices.
gracias. Entonces, una
Thank you very
pregunta
much.
para Michelle.
Now, a question for
¿Están haciendo
Michelle.
las Naciones Unidas
What
para
is the
incidir
United Nations
exitosamente
doing
en
to
cada gobierno en este
have
aspecto?
successful impact on each government in this area? Do you think it's better to have a new code, or should we rather focus on implementing the existing code? Thank you, Leo. I think Audrey and Ignacio also mentioned some of the things that the UN is doing. On the one hand, we need to generate, the UN generates evidence and prepares reports on the status of the code in each country. We know that the latest report was 2022. This week, Thursday, they will launch an updated version, which will serve as a guideline for the countries to identify the gaps they have in their own regulatory framework in terms of the code's provisions. Also, the technical assistance, as Ignacio said, is also very important. We need to do a mapping of the different regulatory frameworks that exist in different countries. That's something UNICEF and PAHO do to support countries in helping them identify the regulatory framework, how they can strengthen it to apply the provisions of the code. And advocacy, and more advocacy at the regional level and in the countries that work a lot with academia and social society to promote breastfeeding. And in terms of the last question,
la vigilancia, seguimiento.
Surveillance and follow-up, control, monitoring. So we focus on monitoring and following up on existing frameworks. I think Ignacio responded to that part. We already have a global framework that is quite robust, quite strong. And so what we need to do is identify the loopholes in each country to strengthen the frameworks and ensure the proper application and implementation of the code, taking into account the resolutions that have been adopted over time. Thank you. And I might add also that we also have the net code, which is a joint initiative of UNICEF and PAHO, World and WHO, where we have two documents, one for continuous follow-up in the implementation of the code. And whenever there's a violation of it, there is a system in place to act immediately. And there's also another document on regular evaluations of the net code. And we will be sharing those tools with you so that all of you can be familiar with them. Thank you very much, Michelle. And I have a question for Audrey.
About Colombia, the regulation of the codes, that it has not been achieved, and how can we have stronger elements to have a code that is being implemented in a mandatory way?
Right, and so this is exactly what I recommended in looking at the regulations which exist and whether there are any gaps. So I would recommend a review of the legislation, but also the monitoring that Leo mentioned just a minute ago, the net code, to see what is really happening and what are the gaps and what can be filled. But also, I think if you need to have some assistance from PAHO or UNICEF, we do have our legal arms which can work with you, and that's what I would recommend. So as I said, this is not an activity for just our health entities. We need the legal help working alongside with us to look at how we can review the laws and make them stronger.
Thank you, Audrey. So with this, we close this first question and answer session, and we are going to move to the country presentations. So first we will have the UNICEF Health and Nutrition Officer of El Salvador. Vamos a pasar a las experiencias de los países con Karen.
We will now go on to the country experiences with Karen Panameño, who is the Health and Nutrition Officer in El Salvador, and she will speak to us about the love law that has been converted to food to encourage protection and support for breastfeeding. Go ahead, Karen.
Karen. ¿Estás ahí?
Are you there?
Hola.
Hola, hola.
Me confirman que
Yes.
me
Can
escuchan
you
bien. No estoy
confirm
segura
that you
si,
can hear
si
me?
se logra
Sí, sí,
visualizar. Voy a
te
intentar
I will try to
escuchamos.
see if I can
voy a
turn my camera on, but I don't know if you can
compartir la
see me. I will try
presentación
to share the
desde
presentation
aquí.
from here.
Perfecto. Solo
Bueno,
falta
primero que
ponerlo
nada,
en pantalla.
The presentation,
Leonardo.
can you please put it
sí,
in presentation form?
solamente comentarles que
Well, I wanted to
quisiéramos
begin
agradecer la oportunidad de poder
by
exponer. Vamos a
thanking
tratar
you
de
for this
hacerlo en el tiempo que
opportunity
nos
to
solicitaron, que nos
present this,
pareció
and
un
I'll
poco
try
corto,
to limit
en
to the time
función
frame
de la
allotted to us,
experiencia
which
que
I
ha
thought
tenido
was
El
very
Salvador y los avances que
short,
ha venido
given the experience El
desarrollando en esta
Salvador has
información,
had and the
la
experience and the
relación que
progress it
tiene la
has made
ley
in
amor
this area,
compartido en
and
alimentos para
the
el fomento, protección y apoyo a la
relationship that
lactancia
the law
materna
called
en El
the
Salvador con el
law
Código Internacional de
converted to
Sucedáneos de Leche
food
Materna.
to encourage the protection and
Bueno,
support
quisiéramos
of
dar un dato
breastfeeding
inicial. La
in El
lactancia
Salvador.
materna
I'd like to begin
exclusiva
by
en los 6
saying that
meses, de acuerdo a la
exclusive
encuesta
breastfeeding in
nacional
the
de
first
salud
6
en el
months, according to the
2021
National
fue de
Health Survey in
45.3. Sin
2021,
embargo, quisiera
represented
destacar que en
45.3%.
el caso de El
But I would
Salvador,
like
tanto el
to
Ministerio de
note
Salud
that in the
como el
case of El
despacho de la
Salvador, the
primera
Ministry
dama
of Health,
llevan un
as well as
dashboard
the
de
First
seguimiento.
Lady's
Creo que
office,
este
have
tema del
a
seguimiento es bien importante y ha
follow
sido
dashboard.
mencionado
I think
como
it's
uno de los
significant.
temas
It's been
clave
mentioned as
para
one of
poder
the
impulsar la
key
lactancia
elements that
materna y protegerla.
encourage
Nosotros
breastfeeding and
desde el
protect
marco de
breastfeeding.
UNICEF hemos
From the
visto que
perspective
un
of
esfuerzo
UNICEF, we've
importante
seen
y
that one
político de alto nivel
major
desde el
and
despacho de la primera
political
dama,
level
la
from
misma
the
primera
office
dama,
of the First Lady. In
desde el
fact, the
gobierno
First
de El
Lady herself
Salvador,
in El
impulsando la
Salvador
implementación
have
de la ley
encouraged
Amor
the
Convertido en
implementation of the
Alimento,
law called
que fue aprobada en septiembre
Love
2022 y entró en
is
vigencia
Food,
en abril de
and that
2023.
was
UNICEF ha estado
approved in
apoyando los
September
diferentes
2022. And UNICEF
esfuerzos,
has been supporting
principalmente para
different
nosotros desde el
efforts of
marco
the
de la ley,
countries
que es muy importante,
under the
pero también
framework of this law,
considerando
which is
otras
significant.
temáticas que
But we have also
considerábamos
taken
que
into
eran
account
trazadoras,
other
como el tema
issues
de
which we
lactancia
felt were
materna en
important,
emergencia,
such as
el Código
emergency
Internacional de
breastfeeding,
Sucedáneos
the
de Leche
International Code
Materna,
on
el
breastfeeding
espectro de acción, es decir, quiénes iban a
milk
realizar qué
substitutes,
labores dentro
the
de este proceso de la ley y
action
obviamente
that should
con
be
ello su
taken, who are the
reglamento, la
stakeholders,
certificación del personal
certification
de
of
salud, que era un elemento esencial y
healthcare staff,
clave,
which
que
was an essential
hubiera un
aspect.
proceso
We
ordenado y
wanted
el
an
gobierno de El
orderly
Salvador
system
tenía
in
muy
place, and the
claro que ese
government of El
proceso lo iba
Salvador
a desarrollar y
had very
tenía
clearly
parte de
in
los
mind that they
recursos
had
para
to
poderlo
develop this,
hacer
and they set
y la
aside
voluntad
resources for
política
doing
de
that.
hacerlo.
And then there
Habían
had
otros
to be the
procesos también
political
que se
will to
fueron
do that.
retomando
There were other processes that
y como
were
les he
also
mencionado, el
considered.
tema de la ley
And as I
misma,
mentioned,
pero también el tema del
the
reglamento de la ley
law
que se cumplió en el
itself
periodo que
and
la ley lo
the
estipula, ¿verdad? Esto
adoption
creo que es
of
un
the
elemento
law
esencial importante
during
que no
the
solo contemos
framework
con una ley,
established by the
sino que
law.
también un
It's not
reglamento
only
que lo
important to
ampare
have
y
a
además
law,
de ello que
but the
pueda bajar
regulations
a
that
normas
support it
específicas, por ejemplo, una
and
norma
that
de
go down
etiquetado
to very
frontal de
specific
sucedáneos de
labels,
leche
for
materna,
instance,
que también
front
son procesos que se
labeling
están
of
apoyando y que
breast milk
creo que
substitutes,
muestran la pauta del
which are important
seguimiento
and
que el gobierno de El
show
Salvador
how
está dando
much
en
follow-up
los
is
esfuerzos del
giving by
Ministerio
the
de Salud
government of El
e impulsados
Salvador
por el
through the
despacho de la
Ministry of
primera
Health,
dama.
and again,
¿Cuáles fueron aquellos puntos que están
supported by the
relacionados
First Lady's office.
al Código
Now, what
Internacional?
are
Bueno, esta,
the
si ustedes
main
miran la
points that
ley
are
al
related to
detalle en el
international
artículo 6,
code?
literal
If you look at
F,
the law
habla de cumplir y hacer
in
cumplir las
detail,
evaluaciones
Article
del Código
10, Article
Internacional de
6
Sucedáneos de Leche Materna, siguiendo las
has
recomendaciones
the
emitidas de
application
dicho
of
proceso de
the
evaluación
International
relacionados a la
Code on
lactancia,
breast milk
así como la
substitutes,
alimentación
and
complementaria. Y este es un proceso que ya hemos
follows
inicializado
up with
con las colegas del
complementary
Ministerio de
legislation.
Salud y
We
del
have done this with
despacho
the
y en
colleagues in
este
the
año
Ministry of
estamos
Health and the
justamente
First
en ese
Lady's office,
esfuerzo
and
de
we are
poder hacer la
now
evaluación
working on
de
that,
este
on
código.
assessing and
Quisiera mencionar
evaluating
otros
the code.
artículos que también
I
nos
want
son
to
muy
mention some
importantes,
other
todos lo
articles
son,
that are
pero
also
quisiera
important. All
destacar,
of them are,
por
but I'd like
ejemplo,
to
el tema
highlight,
de la
for
inclusión de la etapa
instance, Article 10,
preconcepcional en la
inclusion of
ley,
the
el tema de
preconceptional
casos
phase in the law.
especiales para la
Article 11,
reactivación de la lactancia
special
materna,
cases for
el tema de
reactivating
casos especiales
breastfeeding,
para apoyar
or
la
special
lactancia
cases
materna.
to
La lactancia
support
materna
maternal
no es un tema solo
breastfeeding,
de la mujer
because
que
it's
está
not an
lactando,
issue
es un
just
tema de
of
su
the
pareja o si
woman
no tienen
who's
una pareja,
breastfeeding. It's a
de la
problem of her
persona que
partner.
está
And if she
alrededor
does
de
not
ella, es decir,
have a
su
partner, it's a
familia.
person,
Es
people
un
around
tema
her,
de
like her
familia y es
family.
un
It's a
tema de
family
comunidad y de
issue, a community and society issue. And also the special cases for human milk banks. El Salvador is quite in the forefront in this. I'll mention some examples. Also the setting up of breastfeeding rooms, have a user-friendly, welcoming space, and dignified space for a woman to breastfeed and be able to extract maternal milk. And also we have a guideline in the country for setting up these breastfeeding rooms. We also breastfeeding, emergency breastfeeding the forbidding of promotional activities that are quite clear, the international standards that are recommended, and donations, which is something that can occur in high-risk countries. And we know that El Salvador, because of geographic characteristics, could have emergencies at any moment. Also, the activities, the authorities that are responsible. Here's the nutrition office, who need to understand the responsibilities of the law, and then the whole process for complaints. I will mention now some of the characteristics used to develop the guideline for the installation and operation of breastfeeding rooms at the workplace. It's very important for national institutions such as private enterprise, organizations, and academia understand how they can set up a breastfeeding room and have it certified by the Ministry of Health. Also, the guidelines for implementing and making operational the strategy on colostrum in hospitals and promote breastfeeding as an important food, not only for the newborn, but also for the mother. And I'd like to note that to date, we have set up 292 breastfeeding rooms, of which 203 are in government institutions, 52 in private enterprise, in 37 embassies and consulates abroad. Not only did El Salvador provide that geographic space, but in our embassies and consulates outside the country, where people from El Salvador who wanted to be protected could come, we wanted to encourage breastfeeding. We also have activities with advisors and breastfeeding counselors to promote breastfeeding. And this is important because in the case of counselors and advisors, these people have now been trained to speak about the topic and all the details of it. We also saw that health promoters are an essential element to home visits, and the health promoters in El Salvador are considered staff. They are hired by the Ministry of Health. They're not volunteers. This year, we have worked in training the migration staff to have breastfeeding rooms in 4 border posts in El Salvador. In other words, this benefit not only reaches people from El Salvador, but for people who are in migration or in transit or temporary migration, they can then go to a breastfeeding room. We know that the migration people who are not health professionals should be able to understand the topic, and they were trained in this. We also felt that El Salvador should have a page at the health ministry's webpage to speak about the law, which would allow interaction with other institutions, people, and private enterprise. If you go to the webpage of the Ministry of Health, and you can do that when I conclude my presentation, I'd love to have you do that, and you will see their space in peach color. You'll click on that, and you'll see the web page. Love is food, and it's very interesting, very innovative, and allows private enterprise and institutions interact, because we want them to be part of this process. What have been our results? Well, many, but I've had to summarize. We now have the law and regulations. We have made progress in the labeling of breast milk substitutes. More than 500 healthcare professionals trained. More than 300 professionals have been certified as advisors and counselors in breastfeeding. We have 292 breastfeeding rooms that have been set up and ready to be used and are being used. We have 3 human milk banks, 64 centers for collecting human milk, a regulatory framework for colostrum, educational material available, educational and material available in those rooms, and they ensure that the people surrounding them can help. And we have 4 months of maternity and 3 days of paternity leave. I'll talk about that in a minute. And technical guidance for implementation and operation of human milk banks and collection centers. It's very important to have high guidelines on this, how it works. What are our challenges? We have to resume the initiative of the hospitals that are friendly to children and mothers. We have to develop national policies. How can we adapt our hospitals to international standards? And in governance, what does our country want to accomplish? We also have the protocol for the fifth evaluation of the International Code on Breast Milk Substitutes, also educational documents for health milk banks and collection centers. And we need to do advocacy to allow maternity and paternity leave. We're working on that. It's a big challenge, but what's important is that the government of El Salvador, the Ministry of Health, and the First Lady's office have always been very open to talking about this dialogue and negotiating these leaves. What are the next steps? To continue supporting human resources, not only counselors and advisors, but health professionals and other professionals who are also interested in this topic, and develop this educational material and continue to build new breastfeeding rooms and support the milk banks and collection centers. We have some other steps that we can take, but I'll mention some. And we also have the technical labeling for labeling of health milk substitutes, and the how to advertise, rules on advertising and training of our staff, and continue support private enterprise to encourage breastfeeding so that they can comply with the law. And here I'd like to mention something significant according to what I've already mentioned in terms of the breast milk banks in El Salvador. We have been certified as a bank for storing human milk. So with this international certification, it says a lot about the high-level policy and technical support we are receiving and the importance of maternal breastfeeding. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you for sharing this excellent experience of El Salvador. We'd like to thank you for any questions you may ask in the Q&A, and following the next presentation, we'll have space to respond to other questions in live.
Next and last presentation, which is will be given by Marcella Turner Pitt. She is Acting Director of the Nutrition Unit of the Ministry of Health and Wellness of Jamaica, and she will speak about the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes Protecting Breastfeeding in Jamaica. Please, Marcella Turner Pitt, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
You. Thank you for the opportunity to share Jamaica's experience in putting actions in place or strategies in place to promulgate the necessary regulations or legislations to support the implementation of the code. All right, so I'll be sharing with you a little about our local situation in Jamaica, some of the policy initiatives we have in place to address the situation where we are with respect to implementation of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, and what we have planned towards the promulgation of legislations and regulations to support the implementation of the code. So for Jamaica, we have a double burden of malnutrition, where we have a small population of our children who are wasted, some of which are stunted, and over 5% of our children birth to 5 years being overweight and obese. As it relates to breastfeeding, based on data from the recently conducted mixed survey, children less than 6 months, for that population, 33% of them were exclusively breastfed, and breastfeeding continued at 1 year in 47% of that population, and 33.3% of children 20 to 23 months of age. What we have found based on local surveys conducted is that the reasons for the poor nutritional status and the dietary practices are as a result of issues such as lactation problems, such as sore nipples, nutritional problems, such as concerns about growth or weight gain, medical problems where mothers indicate that they have been ill or their children have been ill. In addition to that, there is the inappropriate marketing of breast milk substitutes, and that is coupled with the breastfeeding myths that we have throughout the country, early introduction of other food or drink, and cultural beliefs and attitudes of healthcare workers, women, and their partners, such as healthcare workers may believe that 6 months is too long to exclusively breastfeed. Community members or mothers may believe that breast milk is not adequate for up to 6 months. There are cultural beliefs as well, where persons in the public may feel as if it is nasty to express breast milk. A number of strategies have been put in place to address these issues, such as the promulgation or the development and implementation of a national policy on infant and young child feeding, and this was done in 2018. Following that, in 2020, the Cabinet approved the Strategic Plan of Action for Infant and Young Child Feeding, which supports the implementation of the National Infant and Young Child Feeding Policy. In addition to that, there is provision of supportive health services with infant and young child feeding, counseling during all contacts with caregivers and young children. And this is done during antenatal and postnatal care in our health facilities, well child and sick child visits, as well as regular visits to the health centers for immunization. Jamaica is also implementing the baby-friendly hospital initiative. Currently, we have 8 of our 27 hospitals that provide maternity care certified, and the aim is for within the next 2 years to have all hospitals certified. We have community infant and young child feeding networks, where we have community infant and young child feeding support groups throughout the island, and we have over 55 active support groups. There's also workplace support for breastfeeding. In addition to the recent extension of maternity leave, there has been the introduction of paternity leave, and there have been guidelines that have been developed to support breastfeeding support in workplaces. And we have over 100 workplaces actively using those guidelines. Jamaica is also in the process of developing a policy on healthy eating in workplaces, which has a component for breastfeeding support. We are actively implementing our communication strategy for infant and young child feeding, and we are in the process of promulgating legislations towards the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. And I'm going to share a little bit about the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and where we are now. So currently, there are no regulations or legislations in place in support of the code. What we have is a gentleman's agreement with industry, and that is not adequate. It facilitates voluntary compliance to the code, but there is no guarantee that the code will be adhered to because there are no penalties in place. Now, some of the provisions of the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes have been integrated into maternal and child health policies. The implementation of the code is monitored by the National Infant and Young Child Feeding Committee, which is a multi-sectoral committee which oversees the implementation of all activities pertaining to infant and young child feeding. And so breaches to the code are reported to the National Infant and Young Child Feeding Committee for action. However, enforcement is limited due to the lack of legislation or regulations I had mentioned before, and there are no penalties in place for non-compliance. Reported breaches over the years include cross-border marketing on social media and online platforms, marketing of breast milk substitutes on local television stations, industry influence, including sponsorship of meetings, conferences, or Nurse of the Year award, educational grants, and gifts to healthcare professionals, purchase of discounted breast milk substitutes from distributors by some health facilities, and point of sale promotions in supermarkets. Now, what are we doing to address these? Now, in 2020 and 2023, with the support from UNICEF and PAHO, we hosted 4 consultations with healthcare workers in the 4 health regions in Jamaica. And what we found is that healthcare workers believe that breastfeeding is important and is worth protecting. However, they indicated that there is the financial allocation towards health programs is inadequate. And unless the government provides the tools and funds needed for implementation of programs, they may have to continue to accept gifts or donation from distributors. They also indicated that government needs to support growth and development of staff, for example, through scholarships, funding for participation in conferences, workshops, etc. And there's a need for increased media promotion of breastfeeding because it is recognized that implementing the code by itself will not be adequate as the only strategy to address the issues related to breastfeeding, but a number of approaches need to be taken at the same time. There's also the need to increase the cadre of healthcare workers to provide skilled support to caregivers, increasing the cadre in terms of the number as well as training to build their capacity. And the strengthened workplace support for breastfeeding, because although there is the maternity leave in place and now the paternity leave, only a few workplaces have structures in place to support breastfeeding. In a recent survey that was done in 2021, it was found that of the workplaces surveyed, only 38% of them had at least half of the recommended strategies in place to support breastfeeding. All right, so recently Jamaica developed a position paper on the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitute, and it is now undergoing internal consultations or review. And the hope is that it will be finalized by September of this year. All right, we are also in the process of conducting an assessment of the implementation of the code in Jamaica. And we are going to be, we're using the net code protocol as our guide. It has been initiated and it should be completed by August of this year. We will be engaging a consultant through the support from UNICEF to develop policy proposal and conduct a regulation impact assessment to examine the likely benefits, costs, and effects of the proposed regulations. And we'll be conducting additional consultations with key stakeholders with support from UNICEF and PAHO. In addition to that, we'll be developing guidelines for addressing conflicts of interest amongst healthcare professionals and institutions, particularly those receiving funding, gifts, or sponsorship from breast milk substitute industry. And we'll also consider an enactment of a Breast Milk Substitute Act for the appropriate marketing and distribution of breast milk substitute bottles and teats, as well as ensuring safe and adequate nutrition for infants through the promotion of breastfeeding and proper use of breast milk substitutes. We're also going to be considering development of regulations to operationalize legislation. And the objective of these regulations will be to regulate the manufacture, sale, and marketing of breast milk substitute and to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. And the regulations will be in alignment to the provisions in existing national legislation, policies, and standards, the Constitution of Jamaica, consumers' right to information on goods and services and to the protection of their health, safety, and economic interests, and the WTO agreements. And then we will publish the regulations. Now, we're also considering general guidances, such as the need to employ legislative measures to implement the code over voluntary or self-regulatory approaches, because what we have realized is that in countries where, including Jamaica, where there are voluntary approaches or self-regulatory approaches, in those countries, the code is not normally adhered to. And so we'll be moving towards legislative measures. We also recognize that specificity is needed to address various newer marketing strategies outlined earlier in presentations in the digital space, including provisions on indirect contact via electronic communications, internet helplines, online mother-baby clubs, baby competitions, electronic communication via email or websites, electronic hotlines, remote counseling services, and virtual retail outlet. And we also recognize the need to allocate adequate budgets and human resources to ensure that the national code legislation is monitored and fully enforced, guaranteeing that deterrent sanctions are routinely applied in the case of violations. And we look forward to the continued support from UNICEF and PAHO towards this. And we know that there's a need to develop a robust monitoring and enforcement mechanism to ensure compliance with the code by all stakeholders, including government, manufacturers, and healthcare professionals. And health professional bodies and healthcare workers should carry out their responsibilities under the code and national legislation to avoid conflicts of interest and fully protect, promote, and support optimal infant and young child feeding. And so in the upcoming consultations, the health professional bodies will be included. There's a need to increase awareness of the code among healthcare providers, policymakers, and the general public through educational campaigns and training programs and other communication strategies. And we will partner with civil society organizations to advocate for the code's implementation and monitor compliance, as well as provide support and resources to breastfeeding families. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have listened to two very interesting experiences. I would now like to hand over to Michelle from UNICEF for the second question and answer session before we close.
Thank you, Leo. Muchas gracias a ambos países por sus presentaciones y felicidades por el
Thank you
gran
to
avance
both
que han
countries for their
tenido.
presentations
Creo
and
que
for the
muchas de
progress
las
that has been
preguntas
achieved.
han sido
I believe that many of the
respondidas
questions have already
por
been answered on the
Karen.
chat
Dice
by
Michelle
Karen.
Álvarez, pero
It says
porque
Michelle
usamos
Alvarez
el mismo link,
because we're
pero
using
realmente
the
Karen
same
tiene
link,
ha
but
estado
Karen
respondiendo
is
las
the one
preguntas
who's
del
been
Salvador.
replying to the
Únicamente tenemos una
questions
pregunta
raised by El
adicional para
Salvador.
Jamaica
We have one
en
additional question
relación
for
a cuál es el
Jamaica,
tiempo
and it has
de
to do
maternidad y
with
de
the
paternidad,
time,
de licencia
what
de
it
maternidad y
is
paternidad.
the maternity and the paternity leave. How much time do they get for maternity and paternity leave?
Hola, Michelle. Sí,
Hola.
ahí
Hi,
pusimos la
Michelle.
respuesta de
Yes,
maternidad
we've
en El
already
Salvador
included the
actualmente
answer.
son 4
Maternity in El
meses y de
Salvador is 4
paternidad
months and
4
paternity
días.
leave 4 days.
Muchas gracias, Karen.
Thank
Y
you
en
very
el
much,
caso de
Karen.
Jamaica,
And in the case of Jamaica, can we know what the paternity and maternity leave time is?
Okay, in Jamaica, the maternity leave is for 3 months and the paternity leave is 2 weeks. I'm going to confirm and put it in the chat.
okay, perfect. Thank you, Marshall. Y otra pregunta para El Salvador.
And
No sé
another
si ya
question
la
for El
respondieron en
Salvador, I don't know
relación
whether
al
this has already
etiquetado
been
de sus
answered,
planes de leche
and it
materna.
has to do with the
Pero ya las
labeling.
condiciones
It
provisión de
includes
declaraciones
banning
nutricionales y de salud,
nutritional statements and health
definir nombres y
statements,
diseños diferentes en
different
distintas categorías
names
de sucedáneos para evitar
and
la
labels
definición
in the different
cruzada
categories
o
of
para que nos puedas
breast
elaborar un
milk
poco
substitute
Gracias,
to
Michelle.
avoid
Sí, es un proceso en el que
cross-referencing.
estamos
Yes, Michelle,
todavía.
this is a process in which we're
Hay
still
mucha
involved.
voluntad de
There's a
trabajar
lot
sobre
of
ello por el
will
Ministerio de
to
Salud.
work on this by the
Obviamente
Ministry
esto
of
viene en
Health.
seguimiento del tema
Obviously,
del
this is a
Código
follow-up
Internacional,
on
el tema
the
de la ley,
international
no solo el
code,
tema
the
de la ley
law,
Amor
and
Convertido
not
en
only
Alimentos,
the
sino
law
que
love
pendiente el tema de
that
la ley
becomes a
Nacer con
food,
Cariño, que
but we
ampara
have
mucho estos
the
procesos,
law
¿verdad? He
that
hecho
becomes
referencia más a la
into
ley
words,
Amor
and I
Convertido en
refer to
Alimentos, entonces
the
lleva parte de
law,
estas regulaciones,
love that
tanto de
becomes
ley
a food. It
como
has
de
all these
reglamento. No la tenemos
regulations on
lista,
food, but the regulations
pero
are not
seguramente
ready.
cuando esté lista,
But no
pues
doubt,
aquí
as
la
soon
vamos
as
a
it is
tener
ready,
disponible.
we
No,
will
no me gustaría
make it
dar un
available.
spoiler
I
de
don't
algo
want
que
to give you a
todavía tenemos
spoiler
en proceso de
about something that is
construcción, para
still
ser muy
undergoing
honesta.
the
Sin
construction
embargo,
process,
estamos
to be very
considerando
honest.
muchas de las
However, we're
recomendaciones que se
considering many
mencionan.
of the
Ustedes saben que esto
recommendations
es un
that are
tema también
possible. You know that
desafiante, pero
this
creo
is
que
a
contamos
challenging subject,
con
but
un
I believe that
excelente
we
apoyo
have
político y además un
excellent
excelente
political
apoyo
support
técnico.
and
En
excellent
este proceso
technical
estamos
support.
trabajando con
And
el
so we're
Ministerio de
working on
Salud,
this process. You have the
PAHO y
Ministry of
UNICEF
Health,
de
PAHO and
manera conjunta.
UNICEF.
Entonces,
We
cuando
do
las
this
tengamos listas,
jointly. So as
seguramente va a
soon as
estar
they're
ahí en el
ready,
sitio web
no doubt
que la
it
gente de
will
El
be
Salvador y la
uploaded
podrá
to the El
encontrar.
Salvador website, and you will be able to find it
Muchísimas
there.
gracias, Karen.
Thank you very much,
No veo
Karen.
más preguntas en el chat,
I don't see any
así
additional
que
questions on the chat.
te dejo el espacio, Leo, para que
So
des
let
las
me
palabras
give
de
the
cierre.
floor back to Leo for the closing
Muchas
remarks.
gracias, Michelle.
Thank you
Y
very much,
muchas
Michelle.
gracias a todos los
And thank you very much to
presentadores,
each
los
and every one of the
participantes también.
speakers, the
Muchas gracias a
participants,
los
and thank you very much to
interpretadores
the
que nos han
interpreters
acompañado el día de hoy.
who've been supporting us today.
Hemos visto en este Día
We
Mundial de
have
Protección
seen
de
during this
Lactancia
World
Materna que
Breastfeeding Protection
es
Day
definitivamente
that it is
necesario
definitely
proteger la lactancia
necessary
materna,
to protect
que es un
breastfeeding.
derecho humano,
It is a human
sin
right,
duda, tanto de los niños y
undoubtedly a
niñas
human
como de
right
las
for boys and girls, for
madres.
children, as well
Hemos
as for
visto
mothers.
que
We've seen that
solo dos países
only two
han
countries
adoptado todas las
have adopted
provisiones del
all the
código, pero que
necessary
también en estos
provisions from the
países es
code, but that
necesario
also in those countries,
contar
it is
con
necessary
mecanismos
to
de
have
vigilancia para impedir
surveillance and
las
monitoring
fracciones,
mechanisms
para
in
lo
order
cual
to
tenemos las
avoid
herramientas
infractions. And for that,
netcodes
we have
que
net
sirven,
codes,
digamos,
tools
para
that are
poder
used
detectar
in order to be
inmediatamente
able
las
to
infracciones,
immediately
como
detect the violations,
además poder
as well
hacer
as to be
vigilancia en
able
el tiempo,
to
que en ese
conduct
sentido es muy
surveillance
importante
over
la
time. It
abogacía
is
también
very
de la
important to
sociedad
conduct
civil. Lo
advocacy
hemos
by civil
escuchado
society.
bien en
We've
las
heard that
presentaciones de los
in the
países,
presentations made by the
las
various
dificultades
countries,
que hay.
the difficulties
También
encountered,
estamos ante
and
una
we're
industria
also faced
que
with
invierte cada
an
año
industry that every year
55 mil
invests
millones de dólares
$55
para
million
promover los
in order
usos
to
de la
promote
lactancia materna. Entonces
these breast
necesitamos
milk substitutes. So
evitar
what
los
we need
conflictos
is
de
to
interés
avoid
a pesar
conflicts
del
of
código.
interest in spite of the code.
Digamos, la publicidad sigue siendo
Publicity,
inmensa.
advertising continues to be huge,
Definitivamente es una lucha y
and it
tenemos
is
que poner
definitely a struggle that we have
en
to wage,
legislaciones
a
fuertes,
fight,
medidas y
and
fuertes
we must have
sanciones. Hemos
strong,
escuchado también del
robust measures
Congreso
as well
Mundial
as
sobre la
penalties.
implementación del
We've heard
código.
from the World Congress
Hay
on the
recomendaciones
implementation of the
que
code.
serán
There are
compartidos,
recommendations that were
compartidas
shared
por Audrey. Y una cosa
by
es que
Audrey. And one
conjuntamente
thing
con
is
UNICEF
that
queremos
this be
crear
done together with the UNICEF, because we want to
redes
create together with
subregionales
them
para
some
promover el
sub-regional
código,
networks in order to
tanto
promote the
para
code,
América Latina
both for
como
Latin
para
America as well
el
as
Caribe.
for the Caribbean.
Con eso, pues quiero
With that,
confirmar
I simply
el
wish
compromiso
to
tanto de
confirm
UNICEF
the
como
commitment by
OPS de
UNICEF as
seguir
well as by PAHO
apoyando a los
to
países
continue
en
providing
este
support to countries
esfuerzo. Y
in
les
this
deseo
effort.
una
And
muy
I
buena
wish you
tarde a
a
todo el
very
mundo.
good rest
Muchas
of the
gracias por su
afternoon, everybody.
participación.
Thank you very much for your participation today.